Hello, I'm Jim Rich. I'm the chaplain at Springhouse Estates, and I'm glad to be part of the Acts family, and I'm glad to be able to share this devotional with you today. I wanted to talk a little bit about grace, and if you've been a Christian for any length of time, you know that John Newton was exactly right when he described grace as amazing in his famous hymn. But I've seen in working with Christians over the years that even though grace is amazing, we sometimes struggle with it. And so I thought it would be good to look a little bit today at grace, kind of what it is and how it works. And to demonstrate maybe one of the ways we struggle with what grace is, I'd like for you to take a little quiz. Now, don't panic because you're not going to be graded on it. It won't affect your GPA and it won't show up on the final exam. But here's the quiz. True or false? And so, since it's true or false, you have a 50-50 chance of guessing the right answer. Here's the question, true or false? We are saved by faith. Now, I know you're thinking that's insultingly simple, but if you answer true, you get only partial credit. Because if we go to Ephesians 2:8 and 9, there Paul gives us the answer key where he says, "For by grace are we saved through faith." And so being saved by faith has been kind of a shorthand that we have used over the centuries, but Paul's understanding is correct in that the formula is that we are saved by God's grace through faith that apprehends God's grace towards us. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time thinking more about grace and kind of how it works. And when we think about grace, we're really talking about God's graciousness towards us. And I know that sometimes Christians will say, well, I need more of God's grace. And it almost sounds like they're looking for something kind of tangible that God is going to infuse into them, perhaps like getting a blood transfusion. But if we understand grace to really be God's graciousness, that is his kind disposition towards his creatures, then we know that grace is not something that is a substance. It's actually something that is displayed by God to his creatures. And so when Paul says, I have received God's grace in Ephesians 3:2, he's not talking about a thing. He's saying that God has been graciously disposed towards him. And so hopefully we're seeing God's graciousness being displayed in our lives as well. And so it's kind of amazing when we think about the fact that the God of the universe, who made everything out of nothing and sustains everything, is favorably disposed towards us, because we certainly don't deserve any of his favor or his kindness. And as we think about kindness and his favor, I think we see an illustration that God clearly assumes a positive attitude towards someone who did not deserve it. And we see that clearly in Genesis chapter 3, where Adam and Eve rebelled in the garden. If you recall, after Adam and Eve transgressed, they had one law to obey, and they failed to obey it. When they transgressed God's law, they experienced a change in relationship with God. And they could no longer do what they needed to do for themselves. And so while they were trapped in this sin-ridden situation, God steps in, and in his graciousness, he does for them what they could not do for themselves. He does two things. He gives them a provision and a promise. The provision is that Adam tried to cover his guilt and his shame with a jury-rigged set of leaves, but that costume in no way was adequate to cover, let alone remove his shame and his guilt. And so God gave him a provision of animal skins that cost the animal its lifeblood as a sign to Adam that his sin was that serious that he should have died, and he will die, but God is going to cover his offenses for a time. And the second thing that God did in his graciousness was to give Adam and Eve a promise. And that is that the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15 would crush the head of the serpent. And of course, that's a promise of the Lord Jesus Christ. And with Jesus' earthly ministry and his substitutionary death, he not only as the second Adam fixed everything that Adam originally broke, but he has secured for us so much more that we ever possessed in Adam in the first place. And so when we think about grace in that way, grace certainly is very amazing. And I hope that you are understanding in a clearer way how God is working in your life to display his graciousness in many facets as you seek to not only know him, but to obey him.